To the people who brought us croissants, crepes, Le Snook brings us a show about germs to HBO Max. I am now 1% more sure that we're living in a simulation. We live in a society, and it's amazing how much the concept of germs come up. Germ theory, the amoeba boys, the name Jeremy. I thought I was done with this when Quarantine Crab came around, and now it looks like I'm going to have to do a versus around that. Well, Squish is the latest in HBO Max programming, premiering January 8th on HBO Max. Animation Magazine states, with characters based on real microscopic creatures, Squish aims to educate kids around the world around them, while helping them to better understand the things they may be afraid of. While only a single cell himself, comic book loving, Twinkie eating Squish is big enough to help kids tackle any fear and show that not all bacteria and viruses are bad. Combining friendship, science, and all the tools to figure it all out, this charming animated comedy proves that amoebae have quirks just like us. I was puzzled how there hasn't been much news about this. In fact, I only learned about this when I typed HBO Max into Google to log on to my HBO Max. That's not weird, you're weird. Apparently Cottonwood Media produced this alongside other media I can't say I've seen before. However, considering that this is a show in which both the distributor and production company seem to be France-based, that seems to explain why. That word educate worries me though. I'm not saying that shows need to be explicitly non-educational to be considered for what I can talk about, but the last thing I want to do is dump on a Paw Patrol-esque show for doing exactly what it's supposed to do. However, considering that I am talking about a literal preschool show around this same time, I'm pretty sure this video is coming out before then, I guess this is my free pass after 5 years that I can cash in to talk about something if it actually turns out that this was for preschoolers. So let's look at the first episode, Vinny the Virus. Within this episode, we meet the titular character Squish, a fun-loving amoeba that wants to play kick the spore with his friend Pod, who seems to be more invested in his science experiments than playing with his best friend. We establish a pretty early on dynamic that Pod appears to be the more responsible one between the two, but Squish is the fun-loving one between the two. Pod then reminds Squish about the recent quote catastrophes that Pod had to warn him about, which we get a very quick to the point montage of all the times in which Squish fell into a puddle of water.
And why is there always a water puddle in my
It's at this point I'd love to point out that I love the voice acting for Squish. In particular, he just has a strong presence within the episode, and his voice is a large part of that. I also just love this type of comedy, especially when it pokes at something but cuts it right off before the answer for questions that don't really matter in the grand scheme of the episode. I also just want to say that I love the art style here. It's honestly gorgeous for a show about amoebae. It has this cute soft style in which the inconsistent lining on some objects actually fit within the show and give it a rougher look but maintains this straight out of a book sort of feel, which helps given that this is based on a graphic novel series. Also, is it just me or does Squish look like a gelatin version of the walnut shield dude from Plants vs. Zombies? Unfortunately for Squish, Pod isn't available to play because he's working on something that he flat out says will save Squish's life later on. It is then when we meet Peggy.
Squish, I'll play with you.
Really, Peggy?
Sure, I love a good game of Dress the Spore. We can pretend she's a little baby.
She's an optimistic, well-intentioned, happy-go-lucky amoeba who really has the unfortunate curse of having a ruined first name. I should say that this far, when I was watching this for the first time, I was immersed in everything. The backgrounds of slightly jagged animation, the lip-syncing, the culture of everything. I became a fan almost instantly. However, rather than playing Dress the Spore, they play Kick the Spore. And that's when they meet Vinny.
Oh, that looks like Vinny from my pond studies class.
Really? 'Cause he looks just like the Vinny in my pond studies class.
Hey, buddy, can you kick that back?
This is actually clever dialogue that only makes sense when you look back on this episode for a second time, so put a pin in this. We'll come back to this later. With Vinny's character design, which I do like by the way, it's to the point and emphasizes what we'll see in his personality. I initially thought that with the spikes and athleticism that he was going to be more of a bully character. Little did I know that he was going to be friendly, but a little too friendly. Of course the Squish, seeing that Vinny both met Peggy and Squish in Pond Studies class by the way, two different pond study classes by the way, He just sees someone who wants to play kick the spore for a while and nothing more. Pod, however, is watching this from the sidelines and he's very skeptical of Vinny. Peggy, while accepting as Squish is to Vinny, comes at it from her optimistic, everyone is a friend to her bubbly personality perspective. And it shows that each character thinks differently. And it's not just this groupthink effort where everyone plays a role to just make sure that the writing works. Pod would enter the scene after stalking the trio with a wrecking ball, in which Squish just wants to drive it. He has no purpose for driving it, but wants to operate it because it's a wrecking ball. Who wouldn't want to try it at least once, if not for the controls of the thing? Now for the second time, Pod rejects Squish's attempts to have fun and forget all of the science, but Pod sticks to his plan, which this time he goes a step further.
That virus I saw leaving the park?
His name is Vinny.
And we can all be friends.
Careful with that guy, Squish.
We're mortal enemies.
What? Are you jealous?
I'm not jealous. Viruses can get a little out of control sometimes. I'm just trying to warn you.
'Cause that's what good friends do. Yay!
There's so much great in here. Let's start off with Peggy, who, while not the highlight of this scene, offers a wholesome and refreshing blend of being the bubbly character. She doesn't seem to be overbearing in her natural sense of enthusiasm, but rather reads the room and is just a tad more energetic than her peers, but not to the point where it's over the top and exaggerated. Even though it's more toned down than other bubbly contemporaries, I do enjoy the energy she gives towards the show so far. You also have the conversation here with Pod and Squish. Pod warns Squish that viruses get out of control quickly, as they would in real life, and it's clever phrasing. On one hand, it does explain how viruses tend to work, but it also explains what happens in story, with Vinny as a character, not just a virus. After Pod blows off Squish again to continue with his science project, we get this brief but interesting establishing shot. Here, we see the world of Squish. There's a different language, but it seems to be built like a normal society, just on a microscopic level, with microorganisms being the dominant form of life. They have cars the way that we would, they have roads and pathways the way that we would. It's an interesting take, and I would definitely need to see more episodes to see how they incorporate this relatively human looking society into a world full of amoebae. You would expect there to be fewer conventions than you would see in this establishing shot.
I thought you went home.
I was just looking for someone to kick the spore with.
Didn't we just do that?
No, I don't think so. Let's go!
Viruses tend to get out of control, and this is no different, given that Vinny, or at least another instance of Vinny, who remembers Squish, wants to play kick the spore some more. I actually think it's clever that this Vinny wants to play kick the spore, but then later on, this other Vinny, I'm assuming to be the original Vinny, so let's call him OG Vinny, has no idea of what Squish is talking about. Because from that point on, given if I'm to assume that that's the original Vinny, that Vinny played kick the spore with him at school, but then went home and then went to Squish's house. So he would have had no idea about the second time when they played kick the spore. However, with that second Vinny, if that second Vinny clones himself, he will have the memory of them playing kick the spore twice, because he would have had the same memories of his predecessor and the original Vinny. So for the OG Vinny, his timeline includes kick the spore, but not the second time, which is clever, because it shows how each iteration picks up the past history, but not the future collective history of all the Vinnys put together. Therefore, if you were to look at this from the perspective of there being one Vinny, so the way that Squish would look at it, you would understand why Squish and OG Vinny would be confused about how Squish reacted. Not only does it show how viruses work in a very simple and entertaining way, but it's also a creative way to show the audience that Vinny's duplication will get out of hand, given his great first impression on Squish. Although Squish would soon get tired of Vinny's presence, Peggy would show the opposite, not only being kind to each instance of Vinny that she bumps into, but also not really question why all of them seem to act and function the same, in addition to seeing one of the Vinnys duplicate before her very eyes. This is also minor, but I really appreciate how she is able to take care of the spore like she's still doing it. This is a completely different day. They didn't need to go back to Peggy taking care of the spore because they did it the day before, but it's oddly wholesome how she's just taking this activity and it's now just the thing that she wants to do because she found it fun. I never thought I would string these words together in a sentence because King of the Hill, but I love Peggy as a character.
Squish! Squish. I tried to warn you about this. You don't see Vinny too much. You see too many Vinnies. Scientific fact. A virus is a dangerous microorganism that attaches itself to a cell and makes endless copies of itself until it destroys its host.
Fun, straight to the point. It's definitely not brash or rude or edgy, but given that we have a lot of dark, meta, edgy, rude shows on at the moment, I'm definitely not complaining that we need another one. The graphics were also a neat touch. Of course, Squish, more upset at not being able to hang out with his friend rather than actually being genuine about Pod being jealous of Vinny, would reject the claims of Vinny going too far with him. It shows that he can be a bit stubborn, and while not the most groundbreaking flaw, it's a simple flaw that works with the simple show. I don't expect this show to have massive arcs or deep social commentary. From watching this show, I'll be lightly taught about microorganisms and given a fun, wholesome adventure. It reminds me of something I'd probably see on PBS, but it can also fit as the bridge between Nick and Nick Jr. It's unfortunate that this may appeal to an age too low for it to make sense fitting on Cartoon Network's lineup, because I love this. Of course, all of Vinny's mutations are here, and I use that word intentionally. I like the idea of giving each Vinny a new mutation. I just wish that they fully committed to the idea. I'm sure there are budget reasons, but that would have been a great shot. I'm thinking along the lines of that one Foster's episode where there were a bunch of different blues.
Let's hang out, or do some homework, or kick the spore, or hijack your cell so we can replicate until you explode! What? Too honest?
Great line. So of course, Squish runs and the energy picks up. We see the Vinnies pack in at the 10s, slowly making their way to the 100s if no one's stopping them. This is where Pod comes back in. Apparently, all of this time, he's been assembling a project that involved both construction equipment and a giant Petri dish. Besides a minor animation error, with the goo not showing up within the initial reveal of the Petri dish, I did find this part to be a little too convenient. You're telling me that this entire time he anticipated Squish getting into a situation where he would interact with the virus, to the point where the situation would get out of hand and thus need a giant Petri dish to save the day? If there were negatives about this episode, I didn't get the best impression of Pod as a character here. At times, he seemed rather smug and disassociated, and then at other times, he seemed to be the morally right character who just wants the best for Squish. It was a fine line to walk that this episode didn't really follow. Now that they're saved, they talk it through. Squish realizes what it can mean when a friend doesn't give another friend space. Pod explains that all Vinnies will be okay, where they can grow and also not harm anyone. And Peggy is happy that everything is back to normal and everyone is friends. Honestly, a fantastic episode, and when, not if, when I do my top episodes of 2021, let it be known that unless this year has absolutely killed it with new episodes, this has to make the list. Never have I been so enthralled with the show since Infinity Train, and that aired back in 2019. Honestly, I didn't expect much of Squish, and in fact, I don't expect much of Squish. In fact, I'm sure with all of the episodes out, it'll get some traction, but not much. But I want to do my part in showing anyone interested what a great series this is. It's on HBO Max. I'm definitely looking forward to checking out more, and also maybe covering more, maybe in a versus format, maybe as a whole season, I'm not sure yet. However, what did you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, thank you so much for your time. Until next time, take care. Alpha out.